I completely forgot this feature even existed, and honestly, I think most ARK players did too. Back in 2016, Wildcard released what might have been one of the most ambitious features that's ever been attempted. Not a new creature, not a new map, not even a DLC. Instead, they wanted ARK to build an entirely new world from scratch. Every mountain, river, beach, forest generated differently every single time. When I first heard about it, I thought this was going to change ARK forever, because if you've played ARK long enough, you eventually realize something. Every map becomes solved. The first time I loaded into the island, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. Everything felt dangerous. I'd spent hours exploring because I had no clue what was over the next hill. Finding a metal node felt like discovering some buried treasure. Building my first base wasn't about efficiency, it was about surviving the night. But after hundreds or even thousands of hours, something changes. You already know where the safest beaches are, you know where to get crystal, you know the metal spawns, what caves to avoid, and which creatures are actually dangerous. The mystery slowly disappears, not because ARK gets worse, but because you've just mastered it. So imagine discovering a feature that promised to bring all of that back. A world where nobody knew where anything was. No YouTube guides, no established meta, just an entirely unknown ARK waiting to be explored. Honestly, even today, it still sounds incredible. And somehow, Wildcard actually built it. This feature was called Procedurally Generated Maps, and unlike every other ARK map, this one didn't exist until you created it. Instead of clicking the island or something like Scorched Earth, you were met with something completely different. A screen full of sliders. At first glance, it honestly looked more like a game development software than ARK. You had stuff like landscape radius, mountain height, water frequency, grass density, mountain slopes, ocean floor. There were so many settings that, if I'm being honest, I had absolutely no idea what half of them actually did when I first started. So naturally, I did what every ARK player would have done. I started dragging sliders and just hoped for the best. Some settings created enormous mountain ranges, others flooded half the map. You could make tiny islands, huge continents, massive lakes, steep cliffs, or landscapes that looked like they had been generated by complete chaos. But the really clever part wasn't actually the sliders, it was something called the seed. Every map started with a 3-digit seed number. Think of it like a recipe. If two players used exactly the same seed with exactly the same settings, they generate the exact same world, which meant if you accidentally created an amazing map, you could share it with other people and they'd be exploring that world. Looking back, I honestly think this is one of the smartest ideas Wildcard ever had. Gave the players a chance to create something that had never existed before without needing mods or knowing anything about game development. On paper, this feature had everything. Infinite replayability, unlimited exploration, completely unique servers, a reason to start fresh over and over again. So if the idea was this good, why does almost nobody talk about it today? The first time I played Procedural Maps was back in 2016. I remember sitting there changing sliders for far longer than I probably should have, trying to build what I thought would become the perfect ARK map. Looking back now, don't think I really understood what any of the settings really did back then. I was just dragging them around hoping I'd accidentally create something awesome. Eventually, I settled on a map, hit generate, and waited. Even back then, the loading times were ridiculous. But when it finally loaded, I honestly couldn't stop smiling. Nothing looked familiar. No mountain I had climbed before, beaches I didn't even recognize. I had no idea what was safe and what wasn't. It felt like I was playing ARK for the first time again. And that's why I was so excited, because I thought this has to be the future of ARK. The longer I played though, the more I started noticing little problems. At first, they were easy to ignore. A floating rock here, a strange cliff there. After all, this was ARK. We'd all seen weird bugs before, but eventually I realized something that was much harder to ignore. The world was random, but the adventure wasn't. I'd spend ages exploring, expecting to find something, I don't know, like an obelisk, a hidden cave, an explorer note, anything, but it never came. That's when it hit me. Procedural Maps had recreated the landscape, but not the experience. And I think this is where the whole idea started to fall apart, because the more I think about it, the thing that makes an ARK map special isn't actually the map itself. Everything that's been deliberately placed inside it. Think about the island. The mountains aren't just there to look cool. They're where you go looking for metal. The caves aren't just holes in the ground. They're dangerous places you have to explore if you want the artifacts. Even where creatures spawn matters. You could start on a relatively peaceful beach, then travel inland, and suddenly everything wants to kill you. That progression has been designed, and Procedural Maps couldn't really recreate that. They could generate a mountain, but they couldn't understand why you should want to climb it. They could create an enormous forest, but they couldn't make you wonder what was hiding inside it. And they could generate a completely unique world, but they couldn't give that world a story, which is probably why, once that initial excitement wore off, so much of it started to feel empty. And honestly, I think that's the biggest lesson Procedural Maps taught us. Random doesn't automatically mean replayable, because ARK wasn't memorable just because we didn't know what was over the next hill. It was memorable because there was usually something worth finding when we got there. Normally, when a feature launches with this much potential, you expect it to improve, more updates, more polish, more reasons to come back. But that's just not what happened. Procedurally Procedurally Generated Maps arrived in ARK with update 248 back in 2016, and after that they were almost completely left alone. The bugs stayed, the crashes stayed, the missing features stayed, and perhaps the strangest part, Wildcard never really talked about it again. The map generator never got a proper preview window, you still couldn't choose which creatures would spawn, there was still no obelisks or boss arenas or even proper cave progression. Even new creatures added over the following years never really became part of the feature. It almost felt like procedural maps had become an experiment Wildcard had quietly moved on from. They even included 12 preset worlds, maps like High Alps, Crystal Shores, Redwoods, many islands, but even those couldn't hide the feature's biggest weaknesses. They still didn't feel like a complete ARK map. Eventually, the community just stopped talking about them. New DLC maps came out, new creatures arrived, you had Aberration, Extinction, Genesis, and procedural maps just slowly faded into the background until one day, most people forgot they even existed. But here's the thing, I don't think procedural maps failed because the idea was bad, they failed because they arrived before Wildcard could fully commit to doing anything with them. Think about it, imagine procedural maps today, proper cave system, boss arenas, explorer notes, modern creatures, dedicated server support, actual balancing, and a proper map preview. Suddenly it doesn't sound like a forgotten experiment anymore. It sounds like something people would actually want to play. I honestly think it would be one of the biggest replayability features ARK ever had. Imagine starting a PvP server where nobody knows where metal is, nobody knows the caves, all the hidden base spots, everybody has to then explore again. That sounds like ARK all over again, which makes what's happened next really interesting. When ARK Survival Ascended was announced, procedurally generated maps didn't return. Instead, Wildcard confirmed they were sunsetting the feature. At first, I thought that was the end of that then. Honestly, I thought Wildcard had just completely abandoned the thought of them. But then Wildcard announced something else, ARK Maker. And this is where the entire story gets really interesting, because ARK Maker isn't simply procedural maps coming back. If anything, it feels like Wildcard approaching the same dream, but from a completely opposite direction. Back in 2016, the idea was to let ARK create the world for us. You changed some settings, picked a seed, and the game did the rest. But maybe that was the problem, because a computer could generate the landscape, but it couldn't necessarily understand what made that landscape fun to explore. ARK Maker takes a completely different approach. Instead of asking the game to create the experience, the idea is to give players more power to create experiences themselves. And that's what makes me so interested in it, because ARK players have already spent years building incredible things with mods, custom maps, and completely different ways of playing the game. So imagine what happens when those tools become even more accessible. Nearly 10 years ago, Wild tried to give us an ARK world that could theoretically be different every single time we played. It didn't work. The technology wasn't there, the feature never got the support it needed, and eventually it disappeared. But maybe the dream itself never did. Maybe procedural maps weren't just one of ARK's most forgotten features. Maybe they were the first attempt at something Wildcard had been trying to figure out ever since. And if ARK Maker actually delivers, we finally get to see what the idea could have become. I'm curious, did you ever actually play procedural maps? Or is this the first time you've ever heard they existed? Let me know down below, because I genuinely think this is one of the most forgotten features ARK has ever had.